There is a photograph taken on the afternoon of October 14th, 1971, inside Studio 6 at Cap TV in Los Angeles. In the photograph, a reporter named David Halstead sits behind a broadcast desk, his jacket still pressed, his notes still arranged in a neat row. He is not looking at his notes. He is not looking at the camera. He is looking at the man seated 4 feet away from him. A man who, by every calculation Halstead had made in the 19 years he spent covering Hollywood, should have been rattled by now. The man is not rattled. John Wayne sits in that photograph the way a mountain sits. Without apology, without effort, without the slightest flicker of accommodation. His hands rest on his knees. His jaw is set. His eyes are fixed on Halstead with a quality that is difficult to name. It isn't anger. It isn't contempt. It is something older and quieter than either of those things. It is the look of a man who has already decided. In 4 seconds, Halstead will ask the question he has been building toward for 11 minutes of live broadcast. The question his producers told him would make national news by morning. In 4 seconds, 34 studio personnel, 2 floor directors, 1 audio engineer, and 11 members of the Los Angeles press pool will all stop what they are doing and watch. John Wayne will not raise his voice. He will not stand. He will not reach for a single note or talking point or prepared defense. He will answer in 3 words. And the room will go completely silent. This is that story. To understand what happened inside Studio 6 on that Thursday afternoon, you have to understand what October of 1971 meant in Hollywood. Not just as a calendar date, but as a weather system. The old studio era was over. The moguls who had built the Dream Factory, Jack Warner, Louis B. Mayer, Darryl Zanuck, were either dead, retired, or diminished to ceremonial figureheads. In their place, a new generation of filmmakers had arrived. Younger, louder, more politically engaged, and deeply suspicious of the values that old Hollywood had been built upon. Francis Ford Coppola was 32 years old and 1 year away from releasing The Godfather. Peter Bogdanovich was 32 and had just finished The Last Picture Show. They were brilliant men, and they spoke a different language than the one John Wayne had spent 43 years learning. The cultural pressure on Wayne in the autumn of 1971 was not subtle. His name had become a kind of shorthand in certain circles. Shorthand for everything the counterculture had decided to reject. Patriotism without irony, masculinity without apology, American mythology without deconstruction. He had starred in 153 films. He had won an Academy Award for True Grit just 2 years earlier, in 1969. He had survived lung cancer, the removal of an entire left lung, and a recovery that his doctors described in writing as medically improbable. He was 64 years old, 6 feet 4 inches tall, 215 pounds even after the surgery, and he was, by every measurement that mattered, the most recognizable film actor on earth. None of that insulated him from what was coming. David Halstead had been a reporter for Cap TV since 1961. He had won 2 local Emmy Awards, one in 1964 for a series on Los Angeles housing discrimination, and one in 1968 for his coverage of the Democratic National Convention unrest. He was not a tabloid journalist. He was not a sensationalist. He was, by the standards of his profession and his era, a serious man. In the weeks leading up to October 14th, Halstead had spent 31 hours preparing for the Wayne interview. Reading Wayne's public statements on Vietnam, his 1971 Playboy interview, his recorded speeches at the 1968 Republican National Convention, his comments on the campus protest movements, his opposition to the emerging anti-war cinema. Halstead had spoken with 3 former Wayne collaborators, 2 film historians, and 1 unnamed political operative close to the Nixon administration. He had, in other words, built a case. The interview had been scheduled as a promotional segment for Wayne's new film, Big Jake, which Paramount had released in May and which had grossed $7.5 million in its first 6 weeks, strong numbers in a year when studios were bleeding. Wayne's publicist, Mary St. John, had negotiated the booking under the understanding that the interview would run 12 minutes and focus primarily on the film. The booking confirmation, dated September 29, 1971, specified no political content beyond brief context questions. Halstead's producers had agreed to those terms. Halstead had not agreed to those terms. Not entirely. Not in the way St. John understood the word. The studio that day was arranged for a standard 2-camera sit-down. Wayne's chair positioned at a slight angle to the broadcast desk, a single-floor lamp creating warm fill light to Wayne's left. The crew called it the presidential setup, the same arrangement Cap used when they interviewed sitting senators. It was meant to convey gravitas. It was meant to make the subject feel comfortable. 41 people were in Studio 6 at 2:14 p.m. when Wayne arrived. He came through the side entrance, not the main lobby. He always came through side entrances, a habit left over from the 1950s when fan crowds outside studio buildings had become genuinely difficult to manage. He was wearing a dark gray sport coat over an open-collared white shirt. He carried nothing. No notes, no briefing materials, no handlers walking at his elbow. His assistant, Pat Stacy, waited in the hallway outside. Wayne walked onto the set alone. The floor director, a 29-year-old named Carl Briggs who had been working at CAPC for 4 years, would later tell his colleague Ron Lamont, "I've set up chairs for governors. I've set up chairs for generals. I've never seen a man walk into a room the way John Wayne walked into that room. It wasn't his size. It was the way the room adjusted to him instead of the other way around." Wayne shook hands with 2 stagehands, spoke briefly to the audio engineer who was clipping a lavalier microphone to his collar, and sat down. He did not look at Halstead's notes. He did not ask for water. He glanced once at the 2 camera positions, registered them with the quick professional eye of a man who had been doing this since before most of the crew was born. And then he went still. Completely still. That was the first thing Halstead noticed, the absolute quality of Wayne's stillness. Most interview subjects fidgeted. They checked their watches, adjusted their collars, glanced at the monitor. Wayne sat as though he had nowhere else to be, and no reason to be anywhere else. His hands were on his knees. His eyes moved to Halstead. And Halstead, to his credit, understood immediately that he was in the presence of a man who would be very difficult to rattle through conventional means. That's when he decided to stop using conventional means. John Wayne had been in front of cameras for 43 years by October 14, 1971. The first time he appeared on film was 1926, an uncredited walk-on in a Brown of Harvard production he'd done for $10 to cover a week's rent on a room in Glendale. He was 19 years old and recently arrived from Winterset, Iowa, where his father had run a pharmacy and where Marion Robert Morrison, the name on his birth certificate, not the name the world would come to know, had spent his childhood carrying a quiet and serious attention to the world around him. By 1971, he had worked with John Ford. He had worked with Howard Hawks, Henry Hathaway, Raoul Walsh, and Andrew McLaglen. He had ridden horses in Monument Valley through summer temperatures of 114 degrees. He had done his own stunts until his body physically refused. Not until anyone told him to stop, but until specific joints and muscles reached their structural limit and no further negotiation was possible. On the set of The Sons of Katie Elder in 1965, just 6 months after his surgery, he had refused a double for a scene requiring him to fall down a steep riverbank. The fall required 3 separate takes. The temperature was 103 degrees. He was working with one functional lung. The director, Henry Hathaway, told a Paramount executive afterward, "That man doesn't know how to be stopped. He only knows how to be finished." There was something in the way Wayne's eyes moved during that October afternoon that carried all 43 of those years without announcing them. He didn't scan the room for threats. He didn't perform vigilance. His eyes simply rested on whatever was in front of him. And when they rested on you, you felt the full weight of that attention, undivided and unhurried. Ron Lamont, the floor director's colleague who was working camera 2 that day, described it years later. His eyes didn't move quickly. They moved like he was reading something, and he intended to finish the page. The interview began on schedule at 2:30 p.m. Halstead opened with 6 minutes of standard promotional territory. Big Jake's box office, Wayne's working relationship with his son Patrick, who co-starred in the film, his thoughts on the state of the Western genre. Wayne answered all of it with the specific, unadorned directness that had characterized his public interviews since the 1940s. He did not tell stories to fill time. He answered the question that was asked, and then he stopped. No elaboration beyond what the question required. No performance of ease. At the 7-minute mark, Halstead shifted. The question he asked was this: "Mr. Wayne, you've been very public about your support for the Vietnam War and for the administration's handling of it. Given what we now know, the Pentagon Papers, the casualty numbers, the My Lai report, do you think American young men died for something real, or for something that was invented for them by people who didn't care whether they came home?" The studio went quiet. Not the polite quiet of an ordinary interview pause, A different quality of quiet, the kind that happens when everyone in a room simultaneously understands that something irreversible has just been said. The question had been constructed with precision. It could not be answered with a simple yes or no. It placed Wayne in a corner where agreement meant betraying his public record and disagreement meant defending policies that were, by October 1971, deeply unpopular with a majority of the American public. Halstead's producers had timed the question to come late enough in the segment that Wayne would have no easy exit. They were already 7 minutes in, on live broadcast, with an audience that had just watched a pleasant promotional interview unexpectedly become something else entirely. Halstead had also chosen the framing deliberately. He had not asked Wayne about policy. He had not asked about strategy or geopolitics. He had asked whether the men who died had died for something real. That word, real, was a trap with no visible walls. Because if Wayne said yes, he was dismissing 55,000 deaths as possibly invented. And if he said no, he was validating the full weight of the anti-war argument on live television. A producer named Gail Kessler, 31, who was standing behind camera one, later told her colleague Dennis Faherty, "I've seen ambush interviews before. This was the most carefully engineered I'd ever seen. It wasn't mean. It was surgical." One of Wayne's representatives, a publicist named Tom Graham, was standing near the side entrance. He took 2 steps forward. He stopped. He understood, instinctively, that to intervene in that moment would make the situation worse. That any visible attempt to rescue Wayne would signal to every viewer that Wayne needed rescuing. The room waited. Wayne did not move. For 3 seconds, 3 full seconds, which is a very long time in live broadcast, he held his eyes on Halstead without speaking. Not with discomfort. Not with the searching quality of a man hunting for an answer. With the calm, unhurried quality of a man who already has won and is deciding whether the other person is worth giving it to. And then John Wayne spoke. What happened in the next 14 seconds of live broadcast became one of the most discussed moments in the history of Cap TV, and one of the least documented, because in 1971, the mechanisms for capturing and circulating television moments were nothing like what they would eventually become. No YouTube. No Twitter. No replay algorithm that would push a clip to 4 million viewers overnight. What existed was word of mouth, trade press, and the specific, granular memory of the 41 people who were present in Studio 6 that afternoon. Those 41 people spent the next 30 years telling the same story. Here is what they consistently reported. After 3 seconds of silence, Wayne leaned forward, not aggressively, not theatrically, just slightly, the way a man leans forward when he wants to be heard at a specific volume and is choosing that volume carefully. His right hand moved from his knee to the arm of his chair. That was the only physical movement anyone described. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud. It was not sharp. It was level. The same level it had been for the previous 7 minutes. And it was, by every account, absolutely complete. He said, "They were real." 3 words. The room did not react immediately. In the moment of delivery, the words seemed almost too simple, too direct, too undefended, too unwilling to engage the architecture of the trap that had been set. Halstead had built an 11-minute structure designed to catch a man in a complexity. Wayne had answered outside the structure entirely. He had not said the war was right. He had not said the policies were sound. He had not defended the Pentagon or the administration or the decision-making of any general or senator. He had answered the only question inside Halstead's question that mattered, the one about the men themselves. Their realness. Their existence as human beings who had made a choice in the real world and paid for it in the real world, regardless of whatever political apparatus had surrounded that choice. Halstead stared at him. Not from surprise, from the specific, unnerving quality of a prepared debater whose opponent has just declined to debate. Every counterargument Halstead had constructed in 31 hours of preparation was built on the assumption that Wayne would engage the political frame. He had not engaged it. He had stepped around it with 3 words and left it standing behind him, empty. Carl Briggs, behind camera 2, later described the 3 seconds of silence that followed as the kind of quiet where you can hear the equipment, where you realize the air conditioning is on because you can hear it. Halstead recovered. He was a professional. He had been doing this since 1961. He nodded, made a brief note, and began to redirect the interview back toward the promotional territory it had started in. He asked 2 more questions about Big Jake. Wayne answered them the same way he'd answered the first 6. Specifically, briefly, without elaboration beyond what was required. The interview concluded at 2:43 p.m. 13 minutes total. 1 minute over the agreed segment length. When the floor director called cut, nobody moved for approximately 2 seconds. Then the room adjusted back to its normal working rhythm. Crew members repositioning equipment, an audio engineer removing the lavalier mic from Wayne's collar, Halstead reviewing his notes. But something had settled in the room that had not been there before. Tom Graham, Wayne's publicist, crossed the studio floor to Wayne's chair and spoke to him quietly. Wayne listened, nodded once, and stood. David Halstead stood too. He walked around the broadcast desk and crossed to Wayne. He extended his hand. Wayne shook it. What was said between them in that moment was heard by Carl Briggs, who was 6 feet away coiling cable. He reported it to 3 colleagues, all of whom confirmed the same version. Halstead said, "I thought I had you." Wayne looked at him for a moment. Then he said quietly, "You had the question. You didn't have the answer." Halstead nodded. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. What John Wayne did in those 3 words was not a rhetorical trick. It was not instinct, exactly, though it looked like instinct from the outside. It was the product of a philosophy that had been forming in him since the late 1930s, when he first began to understand the difference between performance and presence. John Ford had taught him the beginning of it. Ford directed Wayne in Stagecoach in 1939 and was famously brutal in his instruction. He publicly humiliated Wayne on set, questioned his talent in front of other actors, pushed him toward exhaustion and uncertainty. Wayne endured it, not masochistically, not out of blind deference, but because he understood, even then, that Ford was teaching him something specific. That the actor who needs to control the room has already lost it. The man who is truly present in a space does not need to dominate it. He simply occupies it, fully, without performance, without the anxious energy of someone who has something to prove. Halstead's question had been designed to make Wayne feel that he had something to prove. It had been designed to trigger the defensive machinery of a man who cared about his reputation more than his clarity. Wayne had not triggered. This was not because he had no emotional investment in the subject. By every account of those who knew him in 1971, the Vietnam question was one that cost him real sleep, real private anguish, a genuine wrestling with the gap between the values he had built his public identity on and the evidence of a world that kept complicating those values. He was not a simple man pretending to be simple. He was a complicated man who had learned to answer from the center of his convictions rather than from the edges of his anger. The center of his conviction, on October 14, 1971, was this. Whatever the politicians had done or failed to do, the men who went were real. Their sacrifice was real. Their family's grief was real. To argue about the policy, to enter the political structure of Halstead's question, would be to implicitly accept that the realness of those men was a point under debate. And that, Wayne had decided somewhere in the stillness before he spoke, he was not willing to do. They were real. 3 words. No adjective. No modifier. No defense, because no defense was needed. That's not stubbornness. That's precision. That's a man who has spent 43 years learning the difference between what a moment requires and what an ego wants to add to it. After the handshake, after the room returned to its working rhythm, Wayne spent approximately 11 minutes on the studio floor talking with crew members. Not talent, not executives, crew. Carl Briggs, the audio engineer, a man named Lou Ferris who had been at CAPC since 1963. One of the stagehands whose name appears in no available record, but whom 3 witnesses described as a young black man in his mid-20s who had asked Wayne a question about horsemanship. Wayne answered the horsemanship question in some detail. He described the specific technique for controlling a horse's lateral movement during a mounted scene. The pressure applied 3 inches behind the cinch, the angle of the rider's knee. He demonstrated the motion with his hands, sitting on the edge of a stool, turning his wrists the way a man turns them when he is explaining something he genuinely cares about explaining. The young stagehand listened carefully and asked a follow-up question. Wayne answered it. 11 minutes. Then Pat Stacy appeared in the hallway doorway, and Wayne stood, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the side exit. He paused at the door, turned once, and raised his hand. Not a wave, exactly. An acknowledgement. A recognition that the room had been part of something. Then he was gone. David Halstead stood at his broadcast desk for a long time after. Gail Kessler, the producer, would later describe it. He was looking at his notes. But he wasn't reading them. He was doing something else, like he was trying to figure out where the interview had gone, the one he'd prepared for. The interview he got wasn't the one he expected, and I don't think he was entirely sure which one was better. 22 years after that afternoon, in 1993, David Halstead gave a lecture at the USC Annenberg School for Communication. By then he was 61, retired from broadcast journalism, working part-time as an adjunct instructor in a course on interview ethics and narrative construction. The lecture, which was recorded and has since been partially transcribed by the university's media archives, ran 47 minutes. For the last 12 minutes, he talked about John Wayne. He described the preparation, the 31 hours, the architectural precision of the question he had designed. He described the 3 seconds of silence. He described the 3 words. And then he said something that his students, according to 3 of them who later wrote about the lecture, did not expect. I thought I was asking a political question. He turned it into a moral one. And the moral one was the better question. It took me about 15 years to understand that I'd come in with a hammer and he'd answered me with a level. And the level was more useful. He paused. The thing about an ambush interview, he told his students, is that it only works if the subject is afraid of the question. If they're not afraid of the question, you've just given them a platform to say the most important thing they know how to say, in front of everyone who came to see them fall. He described the handshake. He described what he'd said. I thought I had you. And Wayne's answer. You had the question. You didn't have the answer. I've been thinking about that for 22 years, Halstead told the room. I still think about it, because the older I get, the more I understand that he wasn't talking about the interview. He was talking about something larger. He was talking about the difference between having a weapon and knowing what to do with it. And I didn't know. He did. At least 2 of the students in that lecture hall became journalists. One of them, a woman named Carla Dietrich who graduated from Annenberg in 1994 and went on to cover international affairs for 18 years at NPR, has spoken publicly about the lecture's influence on how she approached adversarial interviews. Halstead taught me that the most dangerous interviewee isn't the one who deflects or gets angry. It's the one who answers from a place you haven't accounted for, who answers from somewhere so fundamental that all your preparation lands on nothing. That lesson, passed from Wayne to Halstead over 14 seconds in 1971, then carried by Halstead to a lecture hall in 1993, then carried by Carla Dietrich to 18 years of international reporting. That lesson is still moving. Carl Briggs retired from CAPC in 2001. He spent the last years of his career training junior floor directors. He told every one of them the same story about October 14th, 1971. Not as a story about John Wayne specifically, as a story about what it looks like when a person answers from the center of something real. Lou Ferris, the audio engineer, worked at CAPC for 31 years total. He kept, in the drawer of his workbench at the studio, a handwritten note that read, "They were real. J.W. October 14th, 71. When asked about it by a colleague in 1987, he said simply, "To remember what a 3-word answer sounds like." The photograph from that afternoon, the one described at the beginning of this story, was taken by a CAPC staff photographer named Bill Oates at 2:29 p.m., approximately 60 seconds before the broadcast went live. It was archived in the station's internal records library and was not widely circulated until the late 1990s. In the photograph, David Halstead is looking at John Wayne. He is not looking at his notes. He is not looking at the camera. Wayne is looking back. His hands are on his knees. His jaw is set. His eyes hold that quality that is difficult to name, not anger, not contempt, something older and quieter than either. The look of a man who has already decided. Halstead would spend the next 31 minutes preparing to ask the most carefully constructed question of his professional career. Wayne had already answered it. He just hadn't said it yet. 3 words. 35 years in the minds of 41 witnesses. One question that outlasted the interview it came from. He didn't argue the politics. He answered the person. He chose the real question inside the question. There was one confrontation John Wayne never spoke about publicly. Not in any interview, not in any memoir, not in any documented conversation with any member of his inner circle in the years between 1971 and his death in 1979. It happened on a film set in 1974, and the other person involved did not speak about it either. Not while Wayne was alive, and not for 12 years after. What was said in that room, and why both men kept it silent for so long. That's a story for another time.